Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Oliver Hartwig. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our discussion tonight. Because of the event we had last Monday, we're even more grateful to our panelists that they have made it to the event tonight. So we're really grateful that Kevin Lavery and the Honourable Lianne Dalziel of Christchurch have made it to our event tonight. I should introduce briefly what this event is all about. The New Zealand Initiative, as you may know, has been working as a think tank for the past 4.5 years on local government issues. We are strong believers in local government reform. We think that local government can be a force for good, but we think that local government needs and deserves reform. And as I mentioned, over the past 4.5 years, we've produced a range of reports dealing with local government questions on resource management, on local government finance. And this event tonight is to launch our latest report in a series of 3 reports. We introduced previously the local formula, then the local benchmark, and tonight we launched the Local Manifesto, which probably means we have to move on to a new series because we're running out of titles. This is the conclusion of now 1.5 years of work that our colleague Jason Krupp undertook to present our ideas for reform of local government, both governance and local government finance. And we're glad to have 2 expert commentators with us tonight to discuss our recommendations, and I would like to introduce them first. We're joined tonight by the Mayor of Christchurch, the Honourable Lianne Dalziel. And Lianne is, of course, the Mayor of Christchurch, but prior to this position, she was a Member of Parliament for 23 years, serving as a Cabinet Minister in the 5th Labour government. She resigned from Parliament in October 2013 to contest the Christchurch mayoral election and became the 46th Mayor of Christchurch. And in October this year, of course, she was confirmed in a landslide election, finishing more than 60,000 votes ahead of her nearest rival. Would you please welcome Lianne Dalziel? And we're joined by another very busy man at the moment, Kevin Lavery, the Chief Executive of Wellington City Council. He joined the City Council in March 2013. Kevin began his career in English local government, and this included CEO roles at the City of Newcastle upon Tyne and Cornwall Council. Previously, he also worked for a range of private sector organizations, including BT, Pricewaterhouse and Circle. Currently, Kevin, apart from his day job as a Chief Executive of Wellington City Council, is also the Vice President of the New Zealand Society of Local Government Managers. Please welcome Kevin Lavery. But to kick us off and to present the findings of our report, the Local Manifesto, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Jason Krupp. Jason has been with us for 3 years. He's a research fellow working at the initiative and has previously covered resource management, mining, natural resources, urban design, so he's our resident expert on everything local government. And this is his 3rd report in his current series on local government reform. Jason previously worked as a journalist both in New Zealand and in Hong Kong. He's originally from South Africa, but he's a proud Kiwi now. Please welcome Jason Krupp.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for attending the launch of what in effect has been a 4-year research program. Our initial focus started with housing affordability, but we soon realised that the problems in the housing market were intertwined with local government, and in fact many policy areas besides were entwined with the problems that we were seeing in local government. And to fix one of these areas, you had to fix the other. And this is, as Oliver kindly said, the initiative's latest report in the local government series, the Local Manifesto, and it's really what this report intends to do, to fix local government. It's our plan based on our local research and also our international research in Europe and North America. Now, some of you sitting here may ask what's wrong with local government, and that's fair to some degree. The roads, until the shake-up of last week, were drivable. The taps, when we turned them, clean water came out, and someone picks up our rubbish every week. Now, but unfortunately, when you look beyond these simple services, you see that the picture becomes entirely more complex. Decisions about zoning in Auckland, which is a local matter, have national consequences, as do the investment decisions that a district council like Queenstown takes in infrastructure management. But just as important as these big decisions are, so too are the small decisions that someone like Wairoa District Council makes about the 9,000, and because it affects the 9,000 people who live in their district. That's why it's important to have a policy framework in place that ensures councils operate in an open, accountable and transparent manner. Unfortunately, our work over the past 4 years has shown that New Zealand's decision-making framework falls short of this mark. The evidence can be seen in several areas: rising rates bills, questionable spending, the souring relationship between local and central government, ratepayer intractability, over-centralised decision-making, and buck passing. The list goes on. Now, a lot of this blame regularly falls on local councils. I'm pretty sure you could throw a stone in Wellington and you would hit an official who's bemoaning local government competence or making a case why all councils should be merged into super cities. Our research has taken a different approach. Instead of seeing local government behaviour as the source of the problem, we instead wanted to see whether it was a symptom of the legislative framework under which local government operated. There's a lot of evidence to make this point, and it's quite compelling. As we see it, part of the problem is that, well, one of the key problems is that local councils serve too many masters. On one hand, councils are supposed to be democratically answerable to their communities. In fact, it says so in the Local Government Act. But this is a bit of a sham. Local democracies are not guided by the ballot box, but by the planning process. And this technocratic mechanism locks a lot of ordinary people out from having a say in the running of their communities, and it leaves a vacuum that's very often filled by professional advocacy groups. And although it doesn't say it in the Local Government Act, councils, as a creature of statute, are really answerable to central government. With the stroke of a pen, Parliament can hand tasks to local government, set service standards, and dictate local operations. And councils are obliged to take these responsibilities on, or be replaced by statutory managers. At last count, there were more than 30 pieces of legislation that conferred regulatory responsibility to local government, and that excludes the Local Government Act. But while central government is happy to pass on tasks, it's far less forthcoming when it comes to funding for those tasks. And this, in our view, creates what we call an accountability gap. This is the gulf that exists between the people who create the policy and the people who have to bear the effects, and more importantly, the costs of this policy. The problems with blurred accountability also flow both ways. With no bright lines separating which tier of government is responsible for what, councils can and do shift the blame for poor performance onto central government and regulation. They also stray into policy areas which central government is responsible, and in fact ensuring that in some areas there's a duplication of public service. It gets worse when you look at the quality of spending. Now, there is of course a debate about which is the correct yardstick against which to measure local government spending. But when you look at local cost-benefit analyses on major spending, and when this amounts to little more than a list of pros and cons, with the longer making the decision, it clearly puts local council decision-making and spending decision-making into question, and why we see things like Blenheim's theatre fiasco or the cost blowout of Captain's Aquatic Centre. But perhaps a better way of illustrating how we see the problem in local government is with metaphor. If this were a restaurant, the customer would have to order through a committee of waiters. The chef would cook whatever they think the customer really wants, and the restaurant owner would be adding side plates to the menu based on the belief that they know what's best for the customer. So it's hardly surprising that when said customer gets their food, it looks nothing like what they wanted. And when they complain to the chef, the waiters, the restaurant owner, and the chef start fighting over who placed the wrong order, who boiled the vegetarian steak, and who ordered every side dish in the place. Perhaps even more tragically, the customer has to foot the bill for all of this, and they can't choose another restaurant because they're all run the same way. So when you look at it like this, it's hardly a surprise to see 3 out of 5 eligible voters sit out the most recent local body elections. Local democracy in New Zealand is in bad shape, and we believe we know why. Our latest report proposes to fix this by restoring accountability and by handing local responsibility back to communities. Local government, or the Local Government Act, must be amended so that councils are only answerable to one master. their communities. That way, when rates shoot up, communities know who to point the hard questions at. You can't pass the buck when there's no one to pass the buck to. The flip side of this, of course, is that it frees central government to do the things that central government was supposed to do, like focus on national level matters. As it stands, there's no matter too small or too local that a central government minister won't swoop in and get involved. Some prominent examples include a recent review of dog control rules or the recently announced initiative to harmonise camper van bylaws across the whole country. Why, I ask the question, is central government meddling in purely local government matters? Surely it has better things to do than be a helicopter parent? Of course, there will be instances where there are advantages to central government setting policy at the local level. But if it does so, it must bear the costs of this intervention or give communities the opportunity to opt out. Central government's regulatory free lunch has to end. A key feature of local government structures overseas, as we see it, is financial incentives. We certainly saw that in places like Switzerland and in the Netherlands. We need to introduce these in New Zealand. If central government wants to encourage councils to do the right thing, such as pursue faster economic growth or releasing land for housing, it needs to introduce financial rewards from doing so. It cannot hog all the benefits and pass on all the costs and then complain about the status quo. Imagine for a minute how local government and the public's attitude would change to releasing land for housing if government paid local councils a grant for every new house that was completed within a time frame. Or if councils got a slice of the GST that came from any additional economic growth they helped to encourage above a baseline. Our proposed separation of decision-making powers would force a discipline on all parties. It would stop local government straying into policy areas under central government's control and vice versa. Importantly, it would confront communities with the true costs of their decisions. Sure, you can have gold-plated sewer pipes, you just have to pay for it. But before these changes are made, councils need to prove that they can be trusted as wise spenders of public money. Councils also need to show that their actions are steered by the will of the community. Of course, the planning process is technical. It has to be by its nature. But mechanisms like non-binding local referenda and community juries can effectively be used to secure local community buy-in and say-so on long-term plans. The policy recommendations in this report provide a practical means of making both local and central government more accountable. Now, New Zealand has been pursuing the same centrist set of policies for the past 160 years, and I'm pretty sure it's fair to say that we've been dismayed with those outcomes for about just as long. The time to try something new is now. We trust voters to make wise decisions when they elect central government. Why can't we trust them to run their own communities? Thank you.
I'm sort of tempted to start off by picking up on the restaurant analogy and just commenting that we in local government are only allowed to follow certain recipes regardless of what our communities want to order, and we can only use specific utensils provided for in legislation, and we can only charge people for their meal based on the value of their property. So I think that kind of raises some of the issues that I want to comment on. I found a speech I gave 10 years ago when I was Minister of Commerce. I said that if someone was designing this country from scratch, they could not create a more inefficient model for providing the economic and social infrastructure required for just over 4 million people in relation to our landmass. I referenced Mike Moore's famous line that Singapore is the size of Lake Taupo, if you think about it. I was speaking back then of the disproportionate impact of transaction and compliance costs on SMEs of the multiple layers of regulatory frameworks that they were subject to. Fast forward 10 years, and having read this report, it feels like deja vu all over again. My entry into local government from over 20 years in central government 3 years ago, I think offers a unique perspective. But even more significantly, the role that central government has been playing in Christchurch over the past 6 years has been unique as well. The decision to establish a government department to run the post-disaster recovery of a city was without precedent locally and internationally. How central government, local government and the community interact with each other in these post-disaster environments is core critical. And I took some comfort from the Minister's comments yesterday when he said in this particular instance, the problem is the person who calls the shots on that is based in Christchurch, the issue is in Waiā, and the national headquarters is in Wellington. And you just think this is just not the way to work. Well, does that make this a pretty timely report? There were a number of things he thought could be enhanced with a reconsideration of some of the reporting lines and some of the decision points. Spot on. And in many respects, that is what this report is all about. It actually says within the report, the real question is not what's wrong with local government, it's what's wrong with the division of government power in New Zealand. And that is the real question. Who is best placed to make the decision? Who is best placed to the decision once made? And how is the implementation funded? These are three separate questions, and one does not necessarily follow from the other. The decision maker may not be the funder, for example. I thought the most useful contribution I could make to this discussion would be to comment on the new architecture we have developed in the Greater Christchurch area in the wake of the expiration of the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act. The government and the council have essentially established a joint venture regeneration organisation, Regenerate Christchurch, accountable through a statement of intent to both the council and the government. This is unique in our country. We have access to a special regeneration planning framework which replaces objections, hearings and general appeals with community engagement, a prescribed ministerial decision-making framework and restricted appeals. I'm hoping we help set a precedent for a new era in land use management in this country that engages the community in the process from start to finish. We've established an arm's length development company, Development Christchurch Limited, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of our holding company, Christchurch City Holdings Limited. The government has established Otakaro Limited to provide the necessary project management to complete the large-scale anchor projects that remain and manage the divestment of the Crown's interests in land acquired since the earthquakes. We've established a community housing charitable trust with a range of social housing partners, primarily, I have to say, to become eligible for the income-related rental subsidy, which for some reason the government wants to pay to anyone in social housing except local government. I don't quite know why. But I truly think that actually the model is a much better model for delivery, much better at delivering to vulnerable individuals and vulnerable communities. And I think that much better than the council could deliver on its own. So actually we're very happy that we've gone down this track. I've said on several occasions that we would welcome central government transferring its Christchurch Housing New Zealand housing to the trust as well, which would help resolve the main disadvantage of the split between managing the housing with Housing New Zealand from the allocation of tenancies, which now sits with the Ministry of Social Development. Complete disconnect between the two functions, which I think is unfortunate and would be resolved by bringing Housing New Zealand housing into the mix with us. This would give us the ability to build real communities and really get to know the residents, to bring together the kind of wraparound support that a lot of these tenants need at a particular time in their lives. And with the regeneration planning processes, we could fast-track changes that would significantly enhance the quality of life for these residents and build new houses, many more new houses, because of course a large number of these social housing areas actually are underdeveloped in terms of the number of properties that could be built on them today, blending social, affordable and market housing options together, and I think that would be a real opportunity. So in many respects this report could not be more timely. Central government silos were always the toughest nut to crack when I was in government. It seemed to me that there was little capacity to obtain funding for one department's budget when the benefits would be savings to another department's budget many years down the track. If we were to truly break down these silos, would we not start to think about where the difference could really be made, and would that not lead us to contemplate funding through the taxpayer base and delivering through local government? And if the benefits are intergenerational, well, that's fundamental to how we plan in local government. The report has reminded me of the absurdity of central government setting all the rules that they don't oblige themselves to follow, particularly when it comes to prescriptive consultation that isn't in any way meaningful, and the nonsense of our local government fundraising being limited to a property tax when we deliver to a set of national standards that are of benefit to New Zealand Inc. And don't get me started on tax upon tax, because I could be here all night. The report refers to water standards as an example. But let's take the decision announced by the government that they will transfer the decision around fluoridation to the local DHB, but leave the funding of the decision to the local council. Councils don't have funding. They can only raise money from their ratepayers. I think that if government wants to make the decision, they should share the cost across the taxpaying base. In Christchurch, we don't have a single point to fluoridate our water supply. The cost-benefit ratio is quite different for us than it is for other councils. If the government wants to fluoridate, then the government should pay at least its fair share. It does feel like some of the decisions being devolved to us are because central government doesn't want to cop the flak for making the hard calls, but unless they make the hard calls, we can't do the job. I would use the regulation of this sale of liquor as an example of that. Local alcohol plans are meaningless without the other changes that needed to go with it. I totally agree that regulatory impact statements should be required to spell out the hidden costs of local government. It should be an absolute requirement. Christchurch has just hosted the first Singularity University Summit to be held in Australasia. In welcoming Singularity University to the city, I said that we in Christchurch wanted to be at the forefront of the innovation and creativity required to take advantage of the exponential leap in technologies the summit challenged us to contemplate. Not from a position of defensiveness or fear, but rather with a real sense of optimism for a future that we can co-create for ourselves. And I use that word co-create quite deliberately. Co-creation brings with it a sense that we're in this together, a recognition that neither governments nor councils can take on these challenges for our communities. Representative democracy simply doesn't cut the mustard when we don't know what lies ahead. We need a participatory democracy with active citizenship, something that has the added advantage of providing an antidote to the blame game that seems to drive reporting in an increasingly populist media and the unmoderated environment of social media. If we are making the decisions ourselves, it's hard to blame the government and the council. Participatory budgeting is one component of what we intend to implement in this term in Christchurch. The report suggests referenda and citizens' juries. The latter is very much on our radar, but referenda need to be carefully scrutinised given the significant influence of paid advertising on the outcome. Finishing on the circumstances we're confronted with in light of the recent earthquakes, perhaps it is time to think about devolution and subsidiarity in the context of mitigating the risk of having all your capacity at the centre and not distributed in a way that builds resilience. So thank you very much for your report and indeed the whole series. We are very keen in Christchurch to take the debate forward and look forward to the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's been an interesting week. Being a Geordie from the northeast of England, in times of desperation, most Geordies turn to football, probably Alan Shearer scoring a hat-trick against the cross-region rival Sunderland, but I'm an unusual Geordie. I've turned to poetry, and I'd like to share two verses from my favourite poem because I think it illustrates how you deal with a terrible earthquake. Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tied by waiting or being lied about, don't deal in lies or be being hated don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. And the finishing verse, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Now that was a poem written about the Boer War, a failed raid during the Boer War, the Jameson raid in 1895, and I think the qualities needed then are just the same qualities we need today. Keeping your head when all the headlines in the Don Post or Radio New Zealand are going steadily south, dreaming and being ambitious but keeping your feet firmly on the ground, dealing with the crises, many of them, and moving on. Never give up, keep going, be patient, because eventually you will succeed. So we've been trusted by the government to handle a very big earthquake. Why on earth can't we be trusted to deal with far less challenging, more mundane issues, such as what the rules for liquor stores, what opening hours they should have in Wellington, and what time the nightclubs should close. The government have introduced the special housing areas. I'm actually a supporter of that, speeding up planning, cutting through some of the red tape. Why can't we decide that ourselves? Why does it have to be imposed by the government? We're keen to invest heavily in tourism facilities in the city to get more business and leisure visitors. Why can't we charge a bed tax? Why do we have to rely on government to do these things? When I was in the UK, the headhunter said, you're coming to a beautiful city in a far-off place with a stunning natural harbour, blue skies and a gentle breeze. And when I got here, I was really positive about the New Zealand local government system. Actually, compared to the UK, there's a lot more clarity around the role of local government versus central government. There are far more shades of grey in the UK. New Zealand local government is much more self-funding and therefore more independent and self-reliant, and I think we should be really proud of that. Be very wary of relying on central government heavily for grants. It comes back to bite you. And I think we're also really strong on having a divide between governance and management, and that makes for a very professional system of local government here in New Zealand. The UK system is very centralised, and councils were historically regarded as agents of the state, heavily funded by central government, which in the good times is pretty good, but then you get the credit crisis and you lose a lot of government grant overnight. In Cornwall, we lost the equivalent of $400 million worth of annual funding, and we had to let go of 2,000 staff to balance the books. That's how tough it was. Whitehall knew best, and you had to report 180 performance measures annually, just 180, I know it's not many, and we had about 7 inspectors who could come on an unannounced basis and inspect the fire service, child protection facilities, schools, adult care, a whole bunch of things, and it could lead to national intervention with teams of people coming in to manage it instead of the local council. Very big, I've lived in the United States, I've studied in the United States, very big contrast with the culture in the United States. The whole Constitution of the United States was designed to limit the role of the federal government, The federal government could only do what the states allowed it to do, completely the opposite of the Westminster model. And there's a perfect example of that. Apparently in the 60s, when Concorde was being set up by the Brits and the French, they were struggling to find an airport to land in New York. So the French president brings, I think it was President Johnson at the time, and says, can you sort out New York? And he said, absolutely not. There's no way they will take any notice of me. But it's the heart of the American Constitution to actually, from the bottom up, very, very different approach. Now in the very centralised UK, there's been a sea change over the last 10 years under the banner of localism. And so I'd just like to illustrate it with three things which I think we could think about here. The first is the government have given the ability to local councils to actually run centrally provided services if they can demonstrate they can do it better than central government. We did that when I was in Cornwall. I'll give you an example. So if you've ever been to Cornwall, the way you drive there is along the A30. It's a motorway, dual carriageway that goes into Cornwall. Unfortunately, when you reach a town called Bodmin, there's 3 miles of single carriageway. You realise you've reached it because you're probably in a 10-mile tailback by the time you get there. Now, we had been pressing the Highways Agency to do something about this, and they said it's $250 million, it's not a priority. We went to see the coalition government at the time and said, we can build it for half the price. And we put a business case together, and they allowed us to do it. It's being constructed now. So it's a great example of a national service challenged by the locality, and it's actually being constructed now. And it will transform the economy. The second is the City Deal programme. Many of the cities in the UK now have a City Deal. It's a partnership between local and central government to grow the economy. The gist of it is, what can Whitehall do to help a local city like Manchester help UK PLC grow better, grow faster, by giving them some freedoms and flexibilities. Now, Manchester's a really good story, and I know it's briefly referred to in the report. Their growth over 10 years, 45% GDP growth, compared to Auckland, less than half. Massively successful. Third example are devolution agreements, and my old county of Cornwall was another example of this. That was the first rural area to have an integration programme for health and social care. You can't do that nationally. These issues happen around individual families in a particular place, not in the abstract. That's why place management is so, so important. So that UK experience is about earned autonomy, proving that you can do stuff better, doing bespoke deals because places are different and require different solutions, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, focusing on additionality, show that you can grow New Zealand Inc. better by doing this, and public service reform, joining things up well. And I think Jason's timely contribution to this debate has made a great contribution, and I agree with a lot of the points you're making. For me, it's not about ideology or whether central government is better or worse than local government. It's about what works and what's good for the citizen. I also like the emphasis in the report on incentivising local government to behave differently going forward and encouraging more ownership. I find it rather depressing that we've been through 7 years of warfare on local government reform and amalgamation. Amalgamation and imposed solutions are unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. You've got to have the mindset, you've got to have the ownership. And I'd like to see New Zealand take that City Deal approach very seriously. It's been adopted by the UK, it's working, it's now being adopted by the Australian government, and even the US is looking at adopting it. And I think we've got a pretty good foundation in a city like Wellington. We get our Standard & Poor's rating. It'll be interesting to see what the next one's like with the quake. But you know, in the last one we had technically a AA+ rating, but they said we can't actually give you a AA+ rating because that's better than the government, and we're not allowed to do that. So we've got a really firm financial platform. We've got very low debt. We fully fund depreciation on our infrastructure. We've got very few liabilities across the city. We've got a very firm foundation upon which to build. I think the fundamental issue here is, and I'd like to draw a simple analogy, is about central government as the adult and local government as the adolescent. That's what it feels like. And there comes a point where the adult has to let go. And I'll tell you a personal story to illustrate the point. I came over here in 2013, and my eldest child was 13 at the time. And we'd moved around a few times, and it just never occurred to me that there would be a challenge in, moving again to a different place and a different country. So we came over, and I chose where they would live and which school he would go to, and he decided differently. He refused to go to the school. And in the end, we had to take him back to the UK. He missed loads of schooling. I don't know how the hell he did it, but he passed all his GCSEs with flying colours. Then he decided to return on his own terms to New Zealand. And I thought, second time round, I'm going to learn from this. So I said, okay, Daniel, you can choose which school you want to go to. The funny thing is, he's chosen the school I would have chosen, but I think he's going to own the solution. And for me, I think the challenges we're in are very, very similar. It seems to me we've got to make sure that the Beehive doesn't think that Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch and the West Coast are all the same. They're all very different places with different challenges. And I think it's also about we can't be adolescents forever. At some point, local authorities have to grow up. And I think Jason's report raises a number of issues which will help us do that. And I just hope the government will listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our three speakers. We now have time for your questions, but I should announce straight away that the Mayor unfortunately has to leave us at 10 to 7. If we can keep the conversation going a bit longer beyond that. But just so you know, if you've got any urgent questions for the Mayor, perhaps just pass them straight away. Now, who would like to kick us off tonight? Member of the government, great.
Well, actually, I was going to ask a question that occurred to me during the presentation. Do we still need central government? And so, why?
I think it's a question for the Mayor.
I would say yes, of course we do. And there are some things that actually we have been left to do individually that we would hugely benefit from national guidance. So if the government would set the policy standards, for example, for coastal hazards, I mean, our coastline's a little bit like the coastline in the district council next year, and it's next door, and it's a little bit like the coastline that they have in Paranui, and it's a little bit like the coastline. We have the same coastline. So central government should set the national policy standard, and we should be able to implement the local coastal hazard strategy around that, or our district plan rules, based on that guidance. So yes, there is a place for central government. I just think that we've lost contact with the different roles that we are best able to play. And I think that's largely because it comes down to a question of who pays. And unfortunately, the fundraising mechanism for local government is restricted to a property tax.
I think just to add to that, yes, we do. I think central government can create the conditions for local authorities to thrive. And for me, it's really about the duplication and overlap. That's the problem.
So the solution that the problems that people describe has been suggested by many people has been the subsidiarity principle. In other words, responsibility for decisions should be delegated as far as possible, consistent with the competence that's held to make the decision. And Sir Geoffrey Palmer in his book about New Zealand Constitution has suggested precisely that for the New Zealand local government. So would the panel support the subsidiarity principle being adopted in the New Zealand Constitution?
Absolutely. In fact, the local government section of Geoffrey Butler and Palmer's constitution is pretty good, very consistent with what we see overseas. The only complication I see in it is that there's a rich history in New Zealand of constitutional processes being started and going absolutely nowhere. And whether that's a policy, whether that's a political decision or just there's no appetite for it in New Zealand, I don't have an answer to, but they don't seem to progress very far.
Sir Geoffrey and Andrew are coming to Christchurch tomorrow and presenting the book locally, so I'm going to that, and I hope that that's an opportunity for us to again connect this debate with that debate. I think they're very, very connected.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but I think it has to be more than fine words. And I think sometimes we in local government do tend to look to central government to fix our problems rather than be more self-reliant and independent.
Question right at the back.
I've heard a lot about the co-regulation between local council and central government. And I just wanted to hear your take on that. If you thought it existed, if it did, how well was that working? If it doesn't, will it work? Co-regulation, so like your central government is a regulator and you're also implementing a regulation in the local community. Have you heard? Obviously, you haven't heard the term.
Not particularly, no. But I think conceptually, you would imagine that it's a bit hard to be, the active agent working with policy and the person who sets it and regulates it. That seems like there's a bit of a governance issue there, but I obviously need to read up on it a bit more.
Can I just comment about regulatory impact statements, because I think this is a huge important statement in this report, is that regulatory impact statements should be required to say what the cost to local government is or what the impact is. I mean, the word impact is a neutral word. It could be positive, it could be negative. So I think they should be required to show what the impact is on local government and where that connects. So that might pick up where there is, sort of an overlap, or perhaps the distribution between central government involvement and local government involvement hasn't been adequately thought through. I've often found that when people, from my own experience as a minister, is that often people didn't do step number one in the regulatory impact framework. Step number one is define the problem. And it's gobsmacking how many people go straight to the solution without actually bothering to articulate what problem they're trying to solve. And another thing that I've always had a very strong view of, and that was that there should be a sort of a safe harbour period and safe harbour is like protection for the public against governments regulating in the face of a disaster. So, if it's a child having their face bitten by a dog, we should not be allowed to bring in dog regulation rules in the wake of that, because you will always over-regulate. You'll default to that position. So I've always said that we should have a cooling off period where nobody is allowed to regulate while we actually get the facts right.
Could I illustrate it with a very practical example around the alcohol plans locally? We were, in our wisdom, an early mover. So just as I arrived, we were going through an exercise to determine what Wellington's rules should be for the opening and closing times of liquor stores and nightclubs and so on and so forth. We had something like 3,000 submissions. We had 7 days of hearings from interested parties, for and against, and the council came together with a proposed solution. That was then challenged by 2 taxpayer-funded bodies, the police and the health service. It goes up in front of a judge who doesn't have the power to say yes but can say no. So he said we didn't think it was a very good proposal, so he referred it back to us. After spending a fortune on legal processes and other taxpayer-funded bodies also doing the same, we concluded that we would wait a good considerable period of time before we would come up with anything. So it was a system that was simply going round in a circle. Lots of people could say no, nobody could say yes. I was impressed.
I just have a supplementary question, just about the regulatory impact statement. And it's really, Lianne. With regards to the problem definition, and you talked about problem definition, how actively have you been involved in it when decisions have been made in central government about things that are going to be in local government, affecting local government? How actively are you involved in the definition of problems, and how actively are you involved in the third part of the regulatory impact statement, which is options selection?
So do you mean from my prior experience as a minister or now? Now? Very little. Not really. I mean, local government New Zealand has a particular relationship with central government in that regard, and it's really they who lead that role.
Good day. I'm very interested in how these reports are grounded in our physical reality. So like 17 mayors initially and then 31 in December 2015 signed on to the Local Government Leaders Declaration on Climate Change. We've just then had the Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed in December. And then November 4 there was the signing and the convention came into force. At the same time, we've had at least 2 or 3 of the speakers refer to growth as being the outcome, which is the objective in all of this economic growth. What I find is there's a disconnect between what we need in terms of resilience and enabling communities to live and grow in terms of human potential, but not necessarily economically, like in the way that we currently measure economic growth. And if we are to build truly resilient communities, we're going to have to change the language and also the measuring sticks that we're using in order to deliver livable cities, towns, and nation, and also planet.
I mean, I think we need smart growth rather than, more than anything. And obviously, if you're going to spend a lot, and we're certainly going to need to invest even more going forward in Wellington in resilience, and we've got a big spend at the moment, it's the lion's share of our capital programme. It has to be funded somehow. So you've got to actually, you've got to square the circle. So all of these resilience measures, improving the reservoir in southern Wellington, building a connection from the reservoirs under the harbour with a flexible pipe. These things will cost a lot of money, which have to be paid for by a strong, sustainable, growing rating base. Otherwise, it's pie in the sky. We were in a situation as a city over the last 10 years where our capital investment was going like that and our rating base was going like that. That's not a very good place to be. We certainly don't want unbridled growth and silly growth, which doesn't make sense. But if you are able to grow your rating base at a sensible pace, it allows you to make the very investments that you seem to be seeking to make.
Sustainability is part of the resilience question. So I guess I had no background in disaster risk reduction until September 4, 2010. And my sort of kind of exploration of what it takes to recover from a disaster of the 2 earthquakes that we had, in particular, I found that there's no distinction between disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and climate change adaptation. They're all part of the same story. So building resilience is the solution to all 3. That means a different way of decision making. It does mean more devolution of decision making out to local communities, and it does mean communities taking a far greater sense of control and responsibility for decisions that affect their own lives. But it does mean we do need leadership on climate change, and the reason for the compact of mayors really is about providing that leadership at the city level, because it is at the city level that we make the biggest difference. Our city's decided to put this up as one of our top strategic directions for the next 3 years. And what we're looking to is whether we can be trialling new technologies. For example, our airport company is going to be trialling the autonomous electric vehicle on its campus, where it can't drive on the roads in New Zealand because of the regulatory requirements. And we are going to do everything that we can as a city to become carbon neutral by 2040. So, we are certainly putting that up as a top priority.
Before we take the next question, I'm just mindful of the time. I think we're responsible for you missing your flight. So I think that's what we have time for. And I would just like to ask the audience if anybody joining them thank you the mayor.
We're inviting the New Zealand Initiative down to Christchurch to come and further this conversation, and any one of you is welcome to come down and
Thank you
join
very
us.
we're happy to have the conversation in Christchurch and any part of the country that wants to have the discussion, because it's actually something that we think really affects the whole nation. So thank you very much. Thank you. John.
Having had the privilege or distinction of working in 30-odd countries around the world, I'm interested in the examples quoted. We often hear Switzerland quoted in a very positive way. I've seen examples around the world of devolution of decision-making to local communities proving rather disastrous. Papua New Guinea is a good example. So what example should we avoid from the research that you have done? That's one issue. The second one is we're talking about central government versus local government. What's the direction for total government? Do we need more of it, less of it, or about the same?
There's quite a lot in that question. I'll start with, so of course having a limited budget, the second report in the series only allowed me to go to a number of countries. And I think the disastrous example I saw was going to Canada, Montreal specifically, where a very heavy-handed top-down amalgamation strategy was pursued. And again, some of the stuff that Lianne touched on, poor problem definition, very little connection with the history of amalgamation and the outcomes of amalgamation, and it was largely forced on the populace there. And it didn't have a track record. I mean, city spending went up by $400 million in about a year, and that was their operating spending. I think the opposite, the other side of the Montreal example has to be looked at as well, and that's unpicking the amalgamation process. So they tried to unpick their equivalent of the super city there, and they didn't do it completely. So now they have the worst of both worlds. They have a whole bunch of independent municipalities and a limited super city. So I would say be careful the mess you get into, and also be careful how you try and pick it and get out of it. Kevin spoke about Manchester, and I really like the UK experiment with devolution. It's got a lot of flexibility in it, but it also does have the benefit of a contract, and it would allow something that is a disaster to be rolled back very quickly. So what we put in this report is largely a framework for local councils, as their capability allows, to negotiate with central government on the devolution of services, and where they can prove that there's a chance of a better outcome with certain checks and balances in place, so we don't have a moral hazard developing. On the view of total government, I would say that my preference is to have more and lots of local government so that we could have a diversity of choice on the policy settings we want. I'm always nervous about a lack of competition, and the nature of government is that there is a lack of competition. So the more units you have competing with each other, it works as a kind of regulatory market, in my view.
I think that's a really tough question, a big question for a much bigger brain than me, but what I would say is I was pretty impressed with the city deal type approach in the UK, because there was a really clear set of objectives about what they were trying to do, and success or failure was clear. You knew. I worry about things where there are total system changes, there's confusion all around, and you don't know whether they've succeeded or failed. And that's what some of the big reform programs sometimes are like. So I think you've got to be careful, try and break things down, be pretty clear what good looks like and what good doesn't look like. So I think the more you can break these things down, probably the simpler you make them, the better.
And since you asked about international experiences, I would encourage you to just have a look at our second report in the series, which Jason traveled, and you'll find 4 countries dealt with, and you can read that report and other reports in the series free of charge on our website, of course.
Do you charge for the hard copies?
Jason, very report, and obviously from a taxpayer ratepayer perspective, performance pays obviously welcome. But the largest area of reform around local government has been the introduction of more and more co-governance. Hawke's Bay, for example, the regional council under a treaty settlement are now required to go to a co-governance committee and get 2/3 majority approval to change their regional plans. Why is there no reference to these reforms in a report about accountability when obviously co-governance has such an enormous impact on the ability of us, the consumer, to hold the decision makers accountable?
Well, I actually did look into co-governance arrangements at the regional level, and it is covered in the report. And really what I saw it as is a precedent existing in New Zealand to devolve decision-making power to a lower tier of government. So what you actually saw in that particular treaty settlement is that the affected iwi involved can actually make decisions that supersede coastal policy statements. So if we can do it with iwi, why can't we use that as an example? Why can't we use that as a process or a template to do it at a local government level and enforce separations of power? Because, I mean, our main problem definition in this report is that both tiers of government can play across the line, and it's mostly central government playing in local government's patch. And as a ratepayer, you have no visibility into it. I have no problems with co-governance provided there's transparency and accountability, and that comes down to a lot of the governance structures.
I think we've got, certainly in the Wellington region, quite a few examples of councils coming together to tackle particular problems. And it's interesting to see that there are a range of different solutions involving different parties. So I think for example, we have a regional economic agency involving all the councils in the administrative region, but we're looking at urban planning issues just affecting the metro area. So I think there needs to be more of that rather than a sort of rather uniform approach where, because we've got particular administrative regions, which are historical, which don't always relate to the functions that are being covered, that's something we need to do a lot more of.
There's two things, and I think they might be related a bit. Earlier I was thinking of asking you to comment about participatory budgeting, but also in terms of empowerment for local communities, I'm concerned about the proposal for CCOs, and that seems to me to cut right across democracy as well as empowerment. Comment, please.
Well, I think you're sitting in I have no problem with CCOs as a structure within themselves. What I am concerned about is that the councils that vest their assets in these CCOs do so with the buy-in of their local ratepayers and voters. And Wellington is a great example of that. Wellington Water was a CCO set up by a number of councils in the region, and this was done in an open and transparent fashion. What I have a problem with is an agency in Wellington deciding that there will be a CCO in this region and it will encompass these assets, and really putting a thumb on the scale on this. So I think that's the clearest way I can actually say it. On participatory democracy and participatory planning, I quite liked, as an example of it, I don't share some of our research team have more reservations about things like non-binding referenda, but they seem to work very well in Whanganui, where it was, what rate track do you want? Do you want high rates? Do you want high rates increase? These are your options. This is medium, this is low, and you actually got more buy-in. And it was interesting to see the results, because while it was predictable that everybody would advocate for low rates, they actually didn't, and there was a conversation happening. And we've seen other mechanisms like citizen journals, which are covered in the report. But again, everything is about implementation and how it's done as well. I think our current planning system is way too technocratic, way too removed, and by necessity it has to be. So if we can augment it to get citizens to have more of a say in it, would be a good first step.
If I could just comment on the CCO element, I think it's sensible of the government to look to broaden the Local Government Commission's tool set, if you like, so that it's not just about local government boundaries. But I don't think, as a bureaucrat, I'm not sure it's wise to be suggesting that a new CCO should be subject to a referendum. I suspect for some of them, there would be so little interest, the turnouts would be very low, and I'm not sure that provides a great base. I don't think CCOs should be imposed on councils. It's something they should agree to. And I don't think there should be permanent structures either. Councils should be able to say, actually, we don't want to do this anymore going forward. There might be some notice periods around it and things of that kind. But, you know, it's horses for courses. They can work in some cases and they can not work in others. So I think you need to look at that. And I think it should be part of a wider tool set rather than it all be about purely local government boundaries.
But I think there's much more we could debate tonight, but I would like to invite you to do that with us, with more, of course, over a drink. For now, please join me in thanking our speakers, Karen Lavery, two announcements. As mentioned, there will be drinks and nibbles to follow. Please stay and join the conversation. And the second announcement, there will be another event hosted by the Museum Initiative next week, Monday the 28th of November, a lunchtime seminar on better and smarter regulation with Julian Morris, the Vice President of Research at the Reason Foundation in New York. So please join us for that. You'll find all the details about it on the website. That's for tonight. Thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the evening. Thank you.